Hello, fellow humans, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Words, conversations on language, music, and mind in collaboration with speechtherapypd.com. As speech therapists, we aren't used to thinking of memory as a relevant cognitive system that we need to help treat. But what if memory isn't just a filing cabinet of the past, but the very system through which we learn, speak, think, and navigate the current moment? In this episode, I'm speaking with the one and only Dr. Charan Ranganath, professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of California, Davis, and the director of the Dynamic Memory Lab. His research focuses on the cognitive and neural mechanisms of human memory, with particular interest in the relationships between memory, decision-making, imagination, and the self. He is the author of the critically acclaimed book, Why We Remember, which offers a compelling synthesis of decades of memory research and explores how memory shapes our lives, relationships, and identities. In this episode, we explore how the brain uses memory not just to recall facts, but to shape language, perception, and identity. And we unpack how the mind draws boundaries between events, why some moments in conversations stick with us, and how deeply our memories are shaped by stories, schemas, and meaning. For therapists and educators, the conversation offers a lot of practical tools for supporting memory through language, whether it's helping clients build stronger narrative scaffolds, using strategic linguistic cues, or harnessing attention and emotion to boost recall. We talk about how repetition, surprise, and connection all shape what sticks, and how you can leverage these principles in your work. Before we get started, just a couple of items to mention. Most of these upcoming podcasts, including today's, will include an accompanying course on speech therapy PD that is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. And just a couple of necessary disclosures. We each receive compensation from Speech Therapy PD for this podcast, and we will also be discussing Dr. Ranganath's book, Why We Remember. So whether you're curious about how memory really works or looking for ways to help your clients remember better, this episode offers both scientific depth and real-world insight. So, what lies beyond the words we speak? Tune in and find out. All right. Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Ranganath. Welcome to Beyond Words.
Thank you for having me.
So I usually just ask the guests a little bit about their origin story. What got you interested in this field of memory?
Oh, there's so many ways I can answer that. Well, the easiest, probably the most direct answer is that when I was doing my work in grad school, I wasn't actually a memory researcher. At least I didn't think I was. I was studying clinical psychology, and it just so happened I was doing two different things. One is in my clinical work, I was testing patients with brain damage. And as it turns out, almost everyone who came in, if they brought themselves in, they were almost always complaining of memory problems. Even if that wasn't the problem, that's what brought them in. And if people were brought in by their family members, it was very likely a memory problem. And then I was doing therapy with patients, and therapy would always come back to some kind of memories that were traumatic or troublesome, or the way people handled their memories were a big problem. And then, on top of all that, I was actually doing research on depression, but it just so happened that the way we would get people, so we tried to simulate depression in the lab by getting people to think about negative times in their lives. And lo and behold, when they did that, their mood would just tank and they would get really sad. And then we would have to flip that around and have them think about a happy event in their lives to get them back up. And it just struck me in so many ways how pervasive the impact of memory is.
That must be a crazy experience to watch that happen in real time, just people getting depressed from calling up a memory. But I guess it happens like anecdotally, certain songs will bring me back and like to certain memories in the past, and I'll just feel sad all of a sudden. Yeah, I guess maybe it might be helpful to start with, I kind of want to get to the core. When I was prepping for the podcast from your book, which I love, by the way, I kind of got struck by this very simple question, which is maybe just a stupid question, but it's like, what really is memory? Because, when we're talking in real time, for example, I'm ostensibly using what you just said to help guide what I'm talking about. And then, that seems like a form of memory. So it's kind of difficult to tease apart memory that I'm using right now for maybe, let's say, like this ongoing cognition versus something that's like maybe an episode from the past or some like structure that like times tables or something that I know about. Can you kind of tease apart those types of memory for the listeners, or maybe or
Yeah,
for me?
absolutely. It's kind of funny actually because I was talking to somebody who's like a very good writer, and he was very nice about my book, and I was really pushing him to tell me if there's any flaws in it. And he said, "Well, you didn't kind of converge on one central kind of idea that you kept coming back to, but I think that's because of the nature of the topic." And he was absolutely right that it's like, and that's why your question's actually a good one, is you can't really say memory is just one thing and then say, here's the definition and here's how it works. I mean, and scientists certainly love to slice and dice memory in really different ways. Um, and so you can talk about memory in many senses, but one sense is learning, which would be something that happens just by virtue of doing things. And so what I mean by that is you can learn how to do a particular skill. You can learn, so you can learn to surf. I see surfboards in the background and they're shortboards, so you're probably very good. Um, and so you could learn to play an instrument or something like that. But you could also learn in ways that you're not even aware of. Like if you keep using ChatGPT to write your research papers or something like that, eventually your brain will adapt to the kind of things that ChatGPT suggests, and it will be
Mm,
more likely that you will produce that stuff, right?
mm,
So that's a kind of a learning as well. And then there's things that are like, the somebody has a phobia of driving after they get into a car accident. That's a kind of learning that takes place. That's a very, basic motivational system that's driving learning between this kind of a threat response in your brain and body and these stimuli that are out in the world. So those are kind of basic forms of learning. And some people would call them, there's all sorts of terms like procedural memory and non-declarative memory, but they're often related to learning things that are not particularly memories per se, but they're learning that just happens in the course of our daily activities, right?
mm.
Um,
Yeah.
Memory could be then subdivided into episodic memory, which is memory for events, and that's what I study the most. But then there's also semantic memory, which is our knowledge about information in the world. And so one of the big differences is with episodic memory, you can remember something that happened just once and it's tied to a place and time. And so there's nothing, whereas semantic memory is something that you could take everywhere with you and use. It's this kind of a encyclopedia of information in your brain, right?
Mm.
So in semantic memory, surfboards might be associated with the ocean, and they might be associated with waves, and they might be associated with beaches or, wiping out, whatever, right? And those are
Definitely a
all
lot of
kind of
that.
semantic memory things, right? But my episodic memory for this conversation ties you to the surfboard, to that microphone, even though they're meaningfully unrelated to each other. It just so happens they're in this place at time.
Mm, mm,
Another way, and so because of that, people talk about episodic memory as a form of mental time travel. So that if I remember a past event, I'm not just remembering what happened, but I'm actually literally pulling up all this information that happened around that time period.
mhm.
And so getting back to your example of listening to a song, you listen to a song from this time after you got dumped by your partner or whatever. And you don't just listen and go, yeah, I've heard that song before, or I remember the first time I heard that song. It brings back all these feelings about being in that place and time around the time that you were listening to it. And that's that mental time travel power that episodic memory has.
Got it. And I think if I'm remembering correctly, might be wrong, but you mentioned that tying to context is associated with the hippocampus.
That's right.
Got it. Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about it, it's just like overwhelming how much memory covers. I mean, it's really like it seems like the foundational skill for all of learning. I mean, linguistic learning included. We just had someone on recently, Dr. Jenny Safran, who's talking about like statistical learning as, when you're an infant and you start to see these like patterns between, the probability that, if you're trying to figure out how many words is pretty baby and like you're learning how to, categorize these sounds, the statistical probability that T follows pr is really high, but like bay following T is very low. So you kind of figure out these, what is it, probabilities based on lots of experience, and you have to memorize. You kind of not memorize, but you use memory to guide that statistical learning. So it seems like it just really, like on that level, when you're talking about learning, it like underwrites everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reason why it's so ubiquitous is because the brain is plastic. And, this is one of those kinds of misconceptions out there, is that it's like the brain stops being plastic when you get old or something like that. And that's absolutely
Yeah.
not true. The brain is totally plastic, which means it's a moving target. So just the act of a bunch of neurons being active will, at least temporarily, if not, permanently, produce changes in the way those neurons will interact with each other later on. And so that is effectively a constant. What that means is that our brain is changing as a function of our experience constantly, which is by definition almost learning.
Yeah.
So, if our brain's constantly learning, but at some levels it's just completely unconscious, and it just reflects you're being able to hear or see a letter slightly differently in some imperceptible way, but you could measure it if you use the right kind of measure. Um, and then there's, of course, the big ones, which is remembering that whole conversation that you had with Jenny Saffron.
Yeah. So I'm wondering how, if we're thinking about learning as kind of a type of memory, and then, when we're talking now, it seems to be a difference between like us in this particular conversation and using, what you're saying and what I'm saying to guide the conversation, versus then later when I'm saying, oh, I had this conversation, Dr. Ranganath. That seems like there's this, I think you talk about event boundaries. Is this like when we switch contexts and like we sort of think of something as like a past episode, where do we draw that line? How does our brain do this?
Well, there's a lot of arguments about it. So, I mean, just to make sure I'm answering the right question, it sounds like what you're asking is, if you like, our brains kind of will enter sort of one context, but then that context can shift sometimes, so that, the original conversation might have been about statistical learning, and then it shifts to surfing or something like that. I'm kind
Right.
of perseverating on this. This is what happens when you get older. But yeah, so you shift topics like that, right? And so at that point that the conversation shifts, you could ask somebody, okay, well, has one event ended and another began? And somebody listening to this conversation will say, yes, they were talking about topic X, and then they were talking about topic Y. So why does that happen? Um, there's probably more than one reason. One reason seems to be what's called prediction error, which is simply that if you're in a situation that's very predictable, you will be able to say, yeah, the same event is going on. Like, so if I start talking about statistical learning to you, you could probably hear where it's going or come up with guesses for what I'm about to say. But then once I change topics, that would be surprising. And so if I suddenly say, hey, oh, let's go back to surfing for a minute because there's something that I wanted to tell you. So if I did that, then all of a sudden that's a surprise. You weren't expecting that left turn. And
Mm,
so that would lead your brain to shift gears. And that shift of gears would be basically an event boundary.
hmm.
But event boundaries can also happen kind of because of a change in your environment. So you walk from one room to another, and your mental context will shift because you'll feel like you're in a new place, even though you've only walked a few feet outside of this doorway. Your sense of where you are changes. And so that's a kind of a context shift that results in an event boundary, even though it's totally predictable, right?
Got it.
Um, so it can be something that either is a predictable or an unpredictable change in your kind of mental context, your sense of where you are and what you're thinking about and what you're talking about.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So that makes sense that it has to do with prediction error. Yeah. So the book really helped me understand a bunch of different, made sense of a lot of ideas I've been thinking about. Event boundaries was a really cool concept. You also had this concept of a schema that you brought up. And so also, I know you have a cover band called Pavlov's Dogs, and I was in cover bands for a long time. And at some point, because you have to learn so many songs, you kind of realize that they fall into all of these predictable patterns. Like, so,
Yeah.
there's the kind of these like harmonic schemas. Like, I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
that song's just like a 1 5 6 4, something
Yeah.
like that, or that's a 12 bar blues, or and so am I thinking about this right? Might that be an example of like a schema that we kind of use to help us remember predictable patterns?
Exactly. Yeah, totally, totally. So if you hear a blues song that you've never heard before, but it follows a 12 bar blues pattern, about 10 seconds into it, you could generate a whole blueprint of how this whole song is structured, where it's going to go, and so forth. Um, and that's a great example, you know. And sometimes that could cause problems too, because it's like our band plays, like our cover band plays something like 4 or 5 different Ramones songs, and they all sound alike. Just because they all have
All
three
one, four,
chords,
five.
many of them are the
Yeah.
same 3 chords, and it creates a huge problem, you know. So, but that's a great shortcut to learning, because now there's so much that you don't have to think about, right? It's like you can just think about the stuff that makes this event a little different from everything else. What makes this song different from something else? Well, it's a 12 bar blues, but it's in this key, and there's this set of lyrics that go with it, and things like that, right? But having
Yeah.
that schema makes it a heck of a lot easier to learn the song than if it's something, let's say, from a culture that you've never studied their music before and you have no idea where the song is going. Now you have to really form a memory for everything. And our brains don't do well when we have to form a memory for everything. And so it
Yeah.
takes a while, it takes a whole bunch of exposures.
Totally. Yeah. I remember doing a Brazilian music class and learning this like traditional Brazilian music form. I think it was choro or something like that. And the harmony was just so different than what I was used to that I just like couldn't grab onto. I couldn't remember any of the things. I just had to read everything. I had no intuition about where it was going. It was so hard to do.
Mhm.
And this, it kind of reminds me of some of the language stuff that we teach. So like, we often say that you should teach language in familiar contexts because it's sort of, you can use that as a scaffold
Mhm.
to learn things a bit more easily. So like for an example, if I was, in Hungary or something, and like some guy just came up to me and started talking in Hungarian, I wouldn't understand anything. But if I went up
Yeah.
to the ticket counter, like I know kind of roughly, okay, like I'm trying to buy a ticket here, and if he
Yeah.
points to this thing and says something in Hungarian, I sort of am more able to pick up what he's trying to say. I'm like using this schema to
Mhm.
help remember information. And it made me think of in speech therapy, sometimes we do really weird stuff. Like
Mhm.
we'll like do decontextualized flashcards or like test items that like have
Mhm.
not tied to any particular context. And oftentimes you see kids that like you'll show them, you'll ask them this question, and then they'll get it wrong about some definition of a word, and then they're using the word in the right context like right after they
Yeah.
got this question wrong. And it's like it just kind of made me see this again, that like, okay, really we should be using these kind of schemas. It's a teaching tool to our
Mhm.
advantage in language learning. I don't know,
Yeah,
does that
that's
seem?
really interesting actually that you bring that up, because I mean, first of all, that's a really cool example of what you were talking about. But second, it's also cool because often I see the opposite problem where people can regurgitate something in a test of some kind, but then they don't use it in, when they actually need it. And that gap is related to the prefrontal cortex, which is this
Mm,
area of your brain that's like more involved in using information that you've learned as opposed and helping you pull up the right strategies to learn. And so if you memorize something like, some word that you're working on in speech therapy, but you have trouble producing it in the right context, that would be like probably something more to do with the prefrontal cortex, say, than the
Hmm.
hippocampus.
Hmm.
And so you probably, and so schemas can be a good cue to say, hey, this is the word you need to find, right? But often you have the opposite problem where it's like you're finding, like, let's say if you just learn about a word in a classroom, outside of the classroom, the context is so different, like we're saying, that you can't pull it up because you're in a completely new situation. And so you have no reminders to pull up that right memory.
Hmm. Hmm. I see. So when we're um, encoding information or like helping kids learn like linguistic information, for example, does it make sense to use that to our advantage? So, oftentimes we tell the parents to make a routine out of, maybe they're teaching their child how to request something so that, the child's nonverbal and they're learning their first words and, we're teaching them how to say more.
Hmm.
And maybe they come in once and they learn how to say more in speech therapy in this like, separate room with nothing in it or whatever. And then, maybe they don't know how to do that outside of this setting. So does it make sense to try and teach that in as many contexts as possible, like, or, use that word in as many contexts as possible?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, because it's I mean, let's think of the opposite situation, right? Where it's like you have like a song that you've totally memorized since we're in the music theme, right? And it's like you hear like one line and then it's super easy to pull up the next line of the song. But if you were just to pull up that one line in isolation without the music playing and without having heard the other lines, it's often a lot harder to think of a random song lyric, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like that's a great example of when your context is so narrow that you have like a very limited set of ways of pulling up the right information.
Hmm.
So you want to be able to give people so many different contexts that the memory isn't tied to one place or one time. And that's also why spacing out your learning is really important, because if you space out the times that you're trying to learn these words, then what happens is your mental context has changed. And so even if you're in the same place talking to the same speech therapist, it still is the case that you are a different person than you were 1 week ago, right? So that spacing in and of itself can be useful. And so, yeah, I think right now it's kind of an exciting time for clinical interventions because of EMAs, these ecological momentary assessments, and so tools people can use on smartphones. And I think that's has great potential to take a lot of what people do in the clinic and bring them into the real world in interesting ways.
Definitely. Yeah. Because so many times we get kids that will come in and like, they'll be understandably scared. I mean, they're young kids, and so they're not going to do the same things. They're not going to produce the same kind of verbal behaviors that they are when they're feeling really comfortable in the home. So, yeah, it's an exciting time.
Excellent.
So, I was wondering, you also mentioned this other tool, and I was hoping that you can help me kind of tease these apart a bit. And it's not really a tool, but the concept of chunking.
Yeah.
So, in a way, I was thinking of like these harmonic schemas. They almost feel like chunks to me, but chunks are sort of maybe more like lower level, if that makes sense, like a lower level process. So, like maybe when I'm learning, if we're going back to the music thing, like learning a riff that's like, I kind of have that riff now. So if I'm playing a solo, like that riff
Mhm.
becomes like a chunk that I can use. Is that sort of the idea of chunking?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, chunking is just basically a kind of a umbrella term for actively taking what's in front of you and organizing it into a smaller amount of information, right? So, somebody would say, like, you could say, for instance, certain acronyms like FBI, for instance, is like are like a means of chunking the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Once you kind of chunk that into FBI or use CIA or something a little bit less controversial these days, I don't know, PhD,
MBA, yeah,
huh?
MBA, um,
MBA, yeah, whatever, something like that, right?
yeah.
Um, that's those are things that can be chunks, but like you said, music can do that too. And once you really are an expert in music, you can kind of chunk these things in terms of like, scales and modes and you can, like you said, just get a whole thing like this is a 1-4-5 arrangement and in C, and then that takes like, a minute of music and compresses it into one concept, right?
Mm,
And so what that chunking, and there's different kinds of chunking. I mean, relevant to what you do, uh, some of what's involved in motor learning, so like learning to articulate certain things, involves chunking, which would be like kind of grouping together a whole set of movements in order to do something, right?
sure.
But in memory research, we tend to think of it more at a higher level, a cognitive level, where we would say, well, you only have a limited amount of stuff that you can keep in mind at a given time and pay attention to. And so chunking is a way of allowing you to take more information and group it into smaller amounts or to reduce the amount, right? And
Hmm.
you can kind of think of this like in computers, they talk about compression, right? And it's a similar kind of concept is that you want to basically reduce the amount of information that you're keeping in mind to some thing that captures the essence of what you're trying to remember. Um, and what's interesting is getting back to the music, and this is also relevant to speech for sure, is that for whatever reason, I think it has to do with the nature of the language system, but you're more of an expert than I am for sure. Um, is timing of tends to be a pretty critical cue. So, for instance, like if you hear a phone number in the US, it's always grouped in 334. There's three digits, 4 digits. And the only thing that groups it that way is people who go like, 530-757-8750, right? And it's
Yeah.
just the timing of what I said. But that alone takes like 10 digits and makes it into three chunks.
Mm,
Even
mm,
though equally complex, equally same, same number of numbers, it reduces it, it makes it easier. And so when I go to Europe, the phone numbers are insane. They group them in ways I do not understand. And
yeah.
probably if I sat down and studied it, there would be some method to the madness, but it's so much harder than remembering phone numbers here in the US. And this is kind of dating me because nobody memorizes phone numbers here, but but
Yeah.
it's still something you have to enter in your phone at least. So
Yeah. Yeah. There's some old comedy bit where I forget who it was. Someone was talking about how like there's a phone number rhythm, and like they're talking about some guy who just totally goes off rhythm, and it like just sounds so crazy. Like he says it, it's like, oh yeah, that's obvious, like da 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 da. Like so it yeah, it seems like we use that kind of prosodic and melodic information in speech, especially when we're young.
mhm.
Like I was thinking of, there are these little phrases that parents will say, like, like, do you want to this, so do you want to eat? Do you want to sleep? Do you want to, drink? Like these kind of like little chunks that have a certain rhythm and melody and punctuation that infants use to help them like gather the patterns that they need. Yeah, and I think there's some other thing that Jenny was talking about, and Jenny Saffron was talking about, is that like stress patterns in different languages will help kids as well. So like in English, it's first syllable stress and the second one's not.
Mhm.
Whereas in French, it's more like da 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 da. And so like those things can be cues to help us make sense of the world, getting back to like this basic aspect of learning. So it really feels like memory, it's so tied to language learning specifically. It's hard to almost tease them apart when you think about it. You mentioned at some point a little bit earlier, it's something I wanted to ask about. You talked about this idea of like, grabbing something from memory. And you also talked about in the book, I think it was originally Bartlett, who had this idea of, memory as imaginative reconstruction. So,
Mhm.
whereas traditionally we think of memory as something where you like have these storage boxes somewhere, and then you have to go get the memory out and then pull it out. Um, but it's more of this process of generating something, like
Mhm.
generating an imagination. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think this in many ways ties into what we've been talking about with schemas and compressing information, right? If we were to literally form memories of every moment of our experience, there's so much redundancy in what we experience. We would be wasting so much space in memory, so to speak, right? And the fact that our memories are seemingly are limitless is because our brains are super economical about the way we form these memories, right? So if I have a schema for a birthday party, or if I have a schema for a basketball game, those kinds of schemas allow me to say, I don't have to really form much of a memory for the fact that there was cake. I can really just focus on, the details of the cake, right? But I don't have to have everything else.
Mm,
And so what that means is, and this is basically what Bartlett said, is that when we remember a real event, not just remembering a word that someone gave us, but like a real event, we really are getting just little details, little bits and pieces, and
mm,
we pull up the kind of schematic information. And then we use that as the materials for basically saying, okay, let me imagine how this event could have unfolded. And when we do that, it doesn't feel like we're imagining per se. But that's exactly what we're doing is we're kind of creating this little simulation, right? And, I think subjectively many people will have this sense when you kind of go, well, I don't remember that there was a cake, but there must have been a cake at that birthday party. Or I don't remember the, halftime, but there must have been halftime in that game because
mm,
that's what happens. And so, and when we imagine these things, we never, or when we remember an event, let's say it was a 30-minute event, you don't sit and re-experience those 30 minutes. You actually re-experience a much shorter period of time. If you could really spend a minute remembering a 30-minute event, that's a miracle, really, right?
yeah, yeah.
It's very unusual. So what you're really doing is you're getting bits and pieces and you put that together into a story. And what's really interesting about that is you can use that same kind of machinery to simulate events that haven't happened yet. So this was a big discovery in the fMRI era, which was people like Dan Schachter and Demis Hassabis, who actually runs the company Google DeepMind.
Mm,
But these researchers, Kathleen McDermott, they all at the same time ran these studies where they asked people to imagine events and then they asked people to recall the events. And if you looked at the brain activity maps, they looked really similar to each other. And so what that suggested is that really we're doing a lot of the same process when we imagine what has happened in the past or we imagine what will happen in the future, right?
mm,
And it kind of makes sense because if somebody's, let's say he's one of your clients and he comes in for a speech therapy appointment, right? Well, if this client has seen you previously, they can imagine what's likely to happen, the next time they see you, right?
mm,
And that imagination, the simulation of, oh, he's going to ask me to try to remember those words that he was teaching me in the last session, let's say. I'm making this up. I have no idea. This
yeah.
really like.
Yeah. No,
But
it's, yeah, it sounds definitely plausible.
yeah, so even if they've had only one session with you, they can generate a complete simulation of what the next time they'll see you will look like based on their memory for the first time, right? And
Huh. Yeah.
so, and I think that really points to a big purpose of memory, which is memory is really not about the past. It's about the present and especially the future.
Do you think that practicing, so I'm just thinking about this particular client, would practicing imagining events help with memory?
Yeah, it
Would that
absolutely
skill
does.
help? Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
so
Okay.
well, I mean, it does in different ways. So for instance, like if I'm trying to, here's a good example, right? Like I'm sitting in my office at work and I realize that I have to take out the garbage, right? At least if I imagine myself getting home on my bicycle, ride my bike to work. So if I imagine myself getting home on my bicycle and then I imagine myself seeing like the garbage can, would be right by my garage, I will then imagine myself putting my bike down and taking that garbage can to the sidewalk, right?
Mm,
Well, if I imagine that while I'm here, then when I arrive at my garage, I'll see the garbage can and that will trigger the memory in my mind,
okay.
activate it,
Got it.
right? So imagining something that will happen in the future makes it easier to remember that information when you need it.
That seems like a great therapy technique. I'm working right now with a couple of autistic teens, and I often ask them just, okay, tell me one thing that happened last week, and it's it's usually nothing, like can't remember anything,
Mhm.
or it's a like extremely idiosyncratic detail.
Mhm.
And I guess a couple of things. I wonder if it seems to like not be attached to a schema that I'm familiar with, or it might be something that, lacks the context I need to understand it more. So
Mhm.
it seems like a couple of things like helping like walk through particular schemas would be helpful. And then also imagining what might happen during the week would be a trigger for the next time I ask during the following
Yeah.
session. That's so interesting. Sorry, this is a little bit of a departure, but you said something when you were talking that triggered something. You said that memory is not really about the past. It's like
Mhm.
about generation. And I was thinking about this in the context of LLMs. And when an LLM is working, it's not doing something. If you ask it a question like I don't know, what's the capital of this or something like that. It's
Yeah.
not like that information is stored anywhere.
Mhm.
It's just it has a certain capacity for generating that information. Do you think that this is similar to what humans are doing when we're engaging in conversation or language-based tasks?
I think there's some similarities, but a lot of differences too. So, for instance, like one uh, so I guess one similarity is that I think that the neural networks that power LLMs, like they're called neural networks, and they vaguely resemble some aspects of the way, neurons talk to each other and synaptic plasticity happen. But I say vaguely because it's really abstract and really far removed. But what you see in these very deep neural networks is they can learn, some training data, and they can generate stuff that's completely new by recombining elements of what's already been learned. And often it's a very nonlinear, unpredictable kind of output that you wouldn't have guessed they could produce from what they originally learned. And so, yeah, some people will go, "Oh, well, this is all humans are doing is statistical learning, and
Mm,
it's just getting a bunch of training data, right?" Um, but one big difference between humans and LLMs is humans actually gather their own training data. Even a baby, when they're learning to speak, they're looking at particular things and ignoring other things, right?
yeah,
So it's not like even if you strapped a camera to a baby's head and you said, "Oh, look, the LLM now is getting all the visuals that the baby did, and look, the LLM can learn language," or something like that.
yeah.
It's cheating because the baby figured out what to look at,
Mhm.
and so unless you have like a robot that's powering the LLM and they're just figuring out what to do in the world, you're not really simulating what people do.
Mm.
Another thing is that it's like these LLMs will they get everything. That is, they really will see every pixel in an image, or they will get every letter in a word, or every word is kind of tokenized. But it's like people are really massively reducing the amount of information they get. So, when you're looking around, you don't see the entire space and every pixel of what's going on. You just
Yeah.
sort of look at a few key spots and you synthesize this image in your head. And
Mm.
that image, and that's why we're often blind to things that happen in our environment right in front of us, because we don't really see it. We're just grabbing little bits and pieces of what's around us.
Yeah. It seems like a superpower, actually, like a human superpower is our capacity to ignore stuff, like our,
Exactly.
and look at what's relevant to our goals.
Well,
Uh,
and I think that's very power is the key word, because it's like think about the power demands of LLMs right now, and just all sorts of AI applications, and just the sheer like environmental impact of all this, right?
mm,
And it's like a human brain requires, is powered by about as much energy as a couple of light bulbs or less. It's just shocking the differences, right? And that's because we're doing a lot less. We're doing a lot less in terms of processing information. We're doing less memorizing, but what we're memorizing, what we're paying attention to is the key stuff. It's the important stuff. And that allows us to also learn in different ways. So like an LLM, what they do is they train, and then they turn off learning when they start to interact with people. The model doesn't continue to be trained.
mm,
And the reason is that if it did, you'd have this big problem called the continual learning problem. So if somebody started to say things that were inconsistent with what the model had learned, and just as an example, like let's say there was a restaurant that got like, or better yet, let's take an example of a movie that when it came out, it got terrible reviews. And then after the LM's been trained, all of a sudden everyone realized this was a classic movie and it just had all these strengths that nobody ever saw before, even though it flopped at the box office, right?
mm,
Well, if you teach the LLM, if it were to keep learning, it would now have to figure out, okay, is it the case that the movie was bad or was the movie good?
mm,
And it couldn't learn one without losing the other.
mm,
Because humans have episodic memory, we can say, that movie was seen as bad. That movie got terrible reviews. It tanked at the box office. But my friend said it was really good. And
mm.
we can hold those two pieces of information in our brains because the semantic memory is telling us, yeah, that movie flopped at the box office. I don't know where I heard it, but I know that.
Yeah.
And then like my friend telling me, you got to see this movie is this single episodic memory.
Mm,
And so, like a big thing with LLMs is they don't have episodic memory. Um, and then a final thing with LLMs is they don't have motivation that resembles our motivation. So,
mm.
if you were to ask an LLM for life advice, they don't have the same kind of mess of conflicting motivations we have, right? So it's like I can very easily see, you say, you ask an LLM like, I want to get rich quick. Tell me how I can do that. And 5 minutes later, it's telling you to sell your kidneys, and,
Right.
sell your house. It's like there's lots of things you can do to get a lot of money quickly, but that causes a whole lot of other problems. So that's again the kind of thing that and another thing, and I hate to go on and on about this, but it's really kind of a pet peeve of mine is that people keep talking about artificial intelligence like as if it's the same thing.
Mm,
And it's like a big thing too is that people can say how confident they are in something. You and I, as being scientifically trained, we are pretty good at being able to say, I'm not sure, I don't know, or this is what I think, but other people think differently, right?
mm,
And it's like an LLM will just give you stuff. It'll just predict the next word. It will not be able to say, this is what I think, but I could be wrong because it could be X, Y, or Z, and blah blah blah. And so people will read something from the LM and they'll be like, "Oh, it must be true because the LM said that."
Right. Yeah, it's a great reminder. And it also kind of makes me want to train these sort of uniquely human superpowers in a way, or at least appreciate them.
Mhm.
And yeah, it also, like you're saying, like the capacity to ignore and prioritize and have certain types of goals and motivations and agency and be embodied in this world. And those seem like things that we can, you know, celebrate. And yeah, just a reminder too, like when I'm working with clients, sometimes, it's like just when you're in a teacher setting, you want them to remember something, but like it's also uh, sometimes you could celebrate that you don't remember something, or at least, understand that maybe it wasn't remembered because like that thing, you didn't frame it in a way that was important to the client.
Mhm.
And that seems like an important, maybe important strategy too, I
Mhm.
guess.
Yeah. And I mean, we can celebrate forgetting. We can
Yeah,
celebrate the fact that we don't remember everything. And that's actually really good because if we did, it would be really hard to find the information we need when we need it.
that's right. You mentioned there was a story in the book about what was in the Sharashevsky,
Hmm.
um, some guy who could remember like every event in the past, which just I can't imagine what that would be like. But yeah, do you know if was he able to, you know, prioritize and like how did he get on in the world?
Well, the what was really interesting about this guy, so he was a Russian journalist, and his newspaper editor, I think, commented on just what a great memory he had. But the reason he had this great memory in part was because when he would hear things, he would see them or smell them too. It was like he had this condition called synesthesia that
Mm,
made him connect senses in ways that don't necessarily, in a neurotypical sense, go together. And so a word might, elicit this like sense of like, bugs coming out of someone's eyes or something horrible, or it could be something beautiful like the smell of cake or whatever. I don't know. But it's like, so he had this ability to form these super rich, imaginative kinds of memories for things. And that allowed him to build this, memorize huge amounts of information. But it's like he was so in his head, things around him would bring up reminders of all sorts of stuff. And that world of imagination was just too overwhelming. And so it was like he was disconnected from what was in front of him because he
mm,
was remembering all the time.
mm, mm. Yeah, again, I guess another just strong reason to celebrate forgetting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again so much for being here and giving us your time. I was wondering if you could maybe just before we call it quits, if you could give us maybe a few memory strategies, and this could be for all of us,
Hmm.
but for our clients as well. But I think these, given that learning and language and they're also tied, I think that these, memory strategies that you have that would be practical for anyone would be also practical for our clients. So yeah, do you have anything that jumps to mind when you give advice for practical strategies for memory?
Yeah, so I mean, we've talked about some of them already, right? Like, so with schemas and chunking, you can try to imaginatively come up. I mean, a lot of this comes back to imagination in interesting ways, right? It's like you can memorize even arbitrary things like names and faces and so forth if you imagine some way to link it together to one kind of central concept or story. Um, I think like I talk about this a little in the book, but also, I mean, I'm sure you can relate to this, is many times people will memorize things by making it into a song, or many times people will memorize things by making acronyms, like we said, or you can imagine like, there's a technique called the method of loci or the memory palace, where people will imagine certain things in certain rooms of their house. And so if you mentally go back to that room, you can pull up all this information, right? So that's one big, and like we've talked about, if you have to do something in the future, simulate that event in your head and simulate yourself finding some cue that pulls you into doing that behavior. And that will really help you a lot.
Mm.
If you have to say certain words or use and apply it in a certain situation, you can still imagine yourself in that situation if you're not there. Um,
That's really cool.
so that's one big tip. Like if you're trying to remember an event that took place, like where did you put your cell phone or something when you put it down? You could say, well, imagine myself when I walked in the room, just kind of like try to visualize that and remember it, but put yourself back into that place as well as just trying to remember where you put your keys. Put yourself into that whole event by imagining yourself walking into the room and what were you, and then things will start to pop in your head, and often you can pull up a memory that you didn't think you had.
Mm.
um, and then the biggest tip I say for learning is really push yourself in situations where you could fail. um, don't just read the word or repeat it after somebody, but try to generate it on your own. And so, for instance, it's like people have even shown, and we've studied this, other people have studied it, that if you were to give people like um, a word in a new language, right? Like you're trying to learn Swahili or something, and you see this word, and you have no idea what it is, but if you guess the meaning of the word, and let's say you see this word pombe or something, and you say, I think it's corn. And then you find out, no, the word is beer. Well, it turns out making that wrong guess actually helps you learn the right answer much better
Mm.
than if you just said, oh, that means beer. Great. Let's move
Oh,
on.
that's so interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So
cool.
giving yourself a chance to generate the wrong answer allows your brain to correct it.
Mm.
And that correction is a very powerful technique that really allows the brain to not pull up the wrong information. Because the big challenge with remembering is you could pull up the right information, but you equally could pull up wrong stuff.
Mm.
And often that's what happens when we don't remember something, is that the wrong stuff and the right stuff is competing with each other.
Mm.
Um, so, and that kind of also is why, like, if you're trying to learn a song, you play the song. You don't just kind of like read the music, and you don't just like kind of think about it. You actually physically play it. Or you're trying to learn the layout of a new place. You want to drive, not or walk. You don't want to be a passenger in an Uber.
Mm.
And all that is about actively learning. And so the more people can actively generate the kinds of things that they're trying to remember, it's frustrating because it feels like mental effort, and it's frustrating to fail.
Hmm.
But that's all part of the learning process, right?
Great tips. Yeah, definitely. I'm gonna take a few of those and test them out, both myself and some kids I'm working with. But yeah, maybe just a final takeaway. What are you most excited about in the near future? Anything on the horizon that you're researching?
Yeah, we're researching a few things. I think the thing that I'm most excited about is really getting into this concept, which in memory research I think is really kind of still radical, that we really aren't supposed to be remembering a whole lot, that
Hmm.
we're supposed to be remembering very little. And so the kind of standard thinking in neuroscience is our brain's always trying to build memories. Sometimes it usually fails, but sometimes it succeeds. Sometimes we form strong memories, sometimes we form weak memories. And what I'm starting to find in our research is something very different, which is the brain's really grabbing these kind of moments that are important in some way, like event boundaries or things that are emotionally significant and so forth, and really opening up the gates of episodic memory at those points in time. And then the rest of life is just imagination and simulation, and that we're
Hmm.
not really grabbing those points in memory at all. And that might or might not be true, but that's one of the things I'm pretty excited about exploring.
So cool. Yeah. Yeah. Just another, I guess, reason to celebrate forgetting, I
Yeah.
guess. Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Ranganath. You're an inspiration, and I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us. Any place where people can find you? You want to plug your book or anything like that?
Yeah. So you can find my me on Instagram. I'm at my tag is the memory doc,
That's a good one.
all one word. And you can find my website, charanranganath.com. I have a book we've talked about, which is called Why We Remember. It's been translated into many languages, but obviously there's an English language version. It's an audio book as well in ebook formats. And so those are some good ways. And if you want to follow my band, we have an Instagram we're a band called The Null. And I think it's like the null _ Davis is our handle, but you could look it up.
The null as in Null? Null?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, like null hypothesis, null.
Exactly.
Okay,
yeah.
got it. All right. Following right after this.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of nerdy, I know.
Love it.
Yeah, so there's lots of ways in which people can keep up. And if people go to my website, there's a place where you can sign up for a mailing list. And if people are worried about spam, they shouldn't worry, because I have yet to send anything to my mailing list. But once I get around to it, it's going to be good, I'm sure.
You just keep forgetting, which we'll celebrate.
Exactly. There's always something new. So
awesome. All right, everyone. Take care, stay curious, and hope to see you in the next episode. All right. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Beyond Words. It means the world to me that amongst the millions of things that you could be listening to in this noisy world, you used your attention to think about your life and your practice in new ways, and also to think about this deep mystery of language. So today we saw just how deeply intertwined language and memory really are. And I hope you got a lot of value out of this way of thinking, either in your personal life or in your practice. If you enjoyed this episode, it would really make my day if you consider subscribing to the show over on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, and share it with someone who you think might find it valuable. So it really helps the podcast grow. It helps me keep doing what I'm doing. I've got a ton more amazing guests and conversations coming your way, so please stay tuned. Take care.